bokeh effect in watercolor. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you 4 easy ways of doing it. Welcome back to my channel. If we have not met before, my name is Michelle. On this channel, you'll find watercolor tuition, drawing, a little bit of mixed media, even some business and motivation for artists too. Please do consider subscribing. If you click the little bell icon, you can get notified every time I have a new video for you. Make at least one free video a week here on YouTube on a Thursday with extra content for Patreon subscribers. Now, the bokeh effect technique is very popular at the moment. If you don't know what it is, if you've ever seen those photographs where the background is sort of slightly blurry, especially ones that have got lights or things that reflect light and you get all those little coloured circles appear, it's very pretty. And a few months ago people started, I'm sure it's been done before, but it became popular a few months ago. People started replicating it in watercolour. It's really fun to do, it's really beautiful. And I've narrowed it down to sort of 4 main techniques. Now, there's all sorts of tools that you can use to do it, but there are 4 main ways that people actually do this technique. I'm going to go through all of them in this video. We're going to be using, I found this photograph, it's one of these free, copyright-free photograph sites. So I found a photo of a hibiscus flower here, and we're going to do that one today. Now, many of you often ask me, where's the rest of the tutorial, Michelle? So I am actually going to do a full tutorial and I'll do the flower painting next week. So this week we're just concentrating on how to do the bokeh background, all the different ways that you can do it, when you should use it, what colours you should choose, and how to make it work for you. Now, I'm going to be showing you all of these techniques on one painting. However, you probably won't need to do all of them on one painting. You might just want to pick 1 or 2 per painting. That's probably the easiest and the most effective way of doing it, but I'm going to do all of them, throw it all at the drawing board just so that you can see how it's done. As I said, next week we'll do the full drawing and painting tutorial for the flower itself, so don't worry if you actually want to do this particular painting, you'll have the opportunity to do that as well. But first of all, let's get started on the first of our bokeh techniques. I'll be pointing the camera downwards when I need to show you exactly how it's done. Now, the first method for doing bokeh technique is for using masking fluid. Now, this is probably the least popular way. However, I do feel it has its place. It will reserve some beautiful white paper. Now, many people will think that it looks too harsh, but I'm going to show you later in the video when the painting is dry. I'm going to show you a way of softening the edges. It can only be used in fairly small areas. You never want to put masking fluid over very broad areas of your painting because it's likely to tear the paper. So let's get started, and we'll start by making our bokeh with masking fluid. So you can see I've drawn this lovely flower here and I've masked out some of the finer details. As I said, that will be in next week's tutorial. If you're watching this later on, then I'll be linking to that in the video description. So once it's made, I'll put a link in the video description, but you can easily find that tutorial just by searching within YouTube. What I want to do for this first technique is to mask out some of these bokeh circles, but I'm going to do them very small because you don't want to use this for large things. As I said, I've got this stencil here. Well, you're saying, that's fantastic, Michelle. You have this this snazzy stencil, but I'm living in the middle of nowhere and I don't have one. Aha. Well, in just a couple of minutes walking around my house, I managed to grab all sorts of things. So what have we got here? I've got the centre of some Scotchgard tape. I've got this, which is a weight that I use for my pattern cutting when I'm doing sewing. You could also find a washer perhaps in the garage. Make sure it's clean, obviously. I've got this here, which is a cookie cutter. We will later on need to use this central area here. So do make sure that it's not just something for this you can just draw around the outside of something circular. But later on we'll need that gap in the middle. Another thing you can do, and I've got my masking fluid here in a little tub. Another thing you can do is get an old tub like this, and these are typically something that you get hummus in or some kind of sauce with your takeaway, and you can just cut the outer bit off and just leave that ring there. So no excuses, we've all got stencils if we just have a little look around our houses. But I want to do small stencils here, so what I'm going to do is get the smaller areas here. I could use this, couldn't I? That would be a perfect size. I'm going to be careful because some of this masking fluid here is still a bit wet. I'm going to use some different sizes and just going to draw some circles in quite lightly here. The good thing about this is I could, if I wanted to, put one, let's put one here actually. We can just do it behind the petals. So it's quite an accurate way of doing it. So all of the bokeh techniques that I'm going to show you today are good for, for something or other. They've all got different uses, so don't discount any of them, and just see which particular ones your picture needs. And like I said, I don't want to go too large because I don't want to have the issue of not being able to remove these. So I'm going to keep it at that for the small ones. What I'm going to do now is get my ruling pen. This is the tool that I like to apply masking fluid with. You can use other things. It is possible to use a brush if you put some dish soap on it first, but don't do that with your best brushes. Don't risk that. And I'm just going to go around here. And don't worry about getting them too neat, as long as they're fairly circular. And if you've drawn first, then you will get them to be fairly circular. Don't worry about the pencil. That'll come off or be covered up later on. And I'm just going to mask out these circles, and then I'm going to allow them to dry. And I'll also show you later on in the video how we'll soften the results of them. So we'll take these bits of masking fluid off later on, and then I'll show you how to soften them so they don't look quite so hard edged. But for now, I'm just going to place them on, and then you want to allow them to dry. It'll take at least 5 minutes. You can usually see this one here is starting to dry. This one goes a little bit darker as it dries. At this point, if you're enjoying this video, can I ask you, as I always do, to click that like button, that thumbs up button. If you can like, share, subscribe, or leave me a comment, YouTube will push this video out to more people, and more people will get to see my painting tutorials, which enables my channel to grow, which enables me to make more videos for you. Now, the next way of making the bokeh technique appear is to actually lift out whilst the paint is wet. So we're just going to leave that masking fluid that we applied to the paper, we're just going to leave it where it is. Imagine it's not there, and we're going to now apply the paint to the paper. I'm going to show you the best way of applying it, and we're going to actually use some tools for lifting out whilst the paint is wet. Let me show you what you need and how it's done. So we're going to do the fun bit next. We're going to put the background in, and as we apply the background, we're going to lift out some more circles. Now, there are three main things that you can use for this. You can use a sponge. You'll need a circular sponge. You could use something like a makeup sponge. They come in round shapes. You can also get, I don't have any, but you can get these sort of sticks with circle sponges on them that they sell for crafts. You could cut a sponge in a circular shape. Another thing you can use is a circular brush. You want one with a flat end like this. So I've got this brush here. This is actually a makeup brush for applying foundation. Works really, really well. But you'll also find a stencil brush in this shape, or perhaps you have an old brush that you can cut flat across, or flat enough to be of use anyway. So you want a circle brush with a flat end. A third thing that you can use is a cotton bud like this. I think they call them Q-tips in the US. And you'll only get small circles out, but we can do this as well. So a circular sponge or a circular flat brush or a Q-tip like this. And we're going to apply some colours now. We're going to work wet into wet. We're going to start one side and work round to the other. And in places, we're going to lift out a few circles, leaving some room to do our other techniques as we go through this video. So we're generally going to go for the idea of it being darker around this side, which will eventually show up my flower, my light pink flower quite nicely, and lighter over here, just get this idea of light coming in from this side. So I'm going to start over here, and I think I'll start actually, there are areas to fill in the middle here, but I'm just going to start with some of this dark blue. I want to be careful here, I don't want too much green, because obviously I'm going to place greens in on the leaves, and if I do too much green behind, then you won't see the difference. Getting one or two splatters there, I'll just nip those out. They'll cover up later on, that will be fine. So I'm going to avoid here going in too much. I'm going to put a bit of the pink in there. I think I'm going to avoid going in too much here with green, with the idea that I need the greens to show up later on, and just start working around like this. So in these smaller areas, I'm not going to do too much lifting out, and then we'll do a bit more as we come round. I'll need to go in with the brush later on and do all these little areas in between, but we'll start off just coming round like this. Again, going fairly dark here. I might put a bit of the cerulean in and mix it in with some of this Payne's Grey. As you can see, I'm keeping that leading edge kind of wet and coming in like this. So keeping it wet as we come round. As I said, avoiding greens here because I know I'm going to be doing greens later on. Watercolour is a bit like a game of chess. You kind of have to think ahead. Is something going to be light, in which case your background should be dark? Is something going to be dark, in which case your background should be light? You're thinking all the time about showing up those other areas. So as I come around here, I've got some wet paint now, so what I'm going to do is go in with this little cotton bud, and I'm just going to do some little circles like that. Now it's made a very subtle mark and it hasn't lifted out as well as I had hoped, possibly something to do with using the staining colours here. But what you want with the bokeh is you want a selection, so you want some sort of very soft faint ones and you want some hard edged ones, and how it will work is all depending on the sort of pigments that you're using. So you'll find that some pigments will lift out more easily than some other pigments. It's quite fun here to put a bit of pink in the background, but I don't want to go too far into that. I'm going to go in now with, I've got a little bit of the diarrhea yellow, and I've also picked up a little bit of Payne's Grey, and we're getting more sort of brownish colours here. But I want to keep it, overall I want to keep it fairly green based where I'm not right next to the leaves, so I'm going to go in here with some more of the ultramarine and just, as I said, painting around these shapes. It's important to be quick, so don't worry about, you know, being too neat with the shapes. It's more important that you get these colours down quickly. I'm going to go in now with some of that lemon yellow. It's always good to have lemon in the background. It's a cool colour, so it helps things to sink back a bit. And now we've got a bit of a space here. What I'm going to do is go in with my brush and make a circle like this. Look at that, really effective. Now when you do this, you are picking up pigment here. So what you can do is you can rinse your brush. I'm just rinsing it off camera. You want to dry it. Damp is okay, but don't put anything soaking wet on here. Otherwise you'll get all sorts of strange shapes appearing. And then you can lift out some more pigment. So remember, each time you lift out pigment, you need to rinse that pigment away and then have another go. If it's lifted out enough on the first attempt, that's fine. And see our masking fluid here, we're just going to go right the way across the top of it. Let's have another go with the cotton bud. Let's try one here. Not too bad. You could use a brush, of course, just to lift out a circle. I find it easier to use something that already has a circle shape to it. And you want to make sure that you keep this leading edge wet. It doesn't matter if you get a few, drying lines appearing in the background. If you're a beginner, that's very likely to happen, but really don't worry about it. It's all a learning process. But try not to stop and leave an edge like this just to get completely dry, because you can end up with very strange shapes appearing. I'm going to start going a little bit lighter towards this top edge here, and let's keep that edge there wet. Any areas that we've got masking fluid on, we can paint straight across the top of them. And again, I'm going to take my round brush and lift out another round shape. And rinse and dry. Very important, make sure your brush is dry enough. And then we can take out a little bit more like so, and we're getting that lovely soft edged round shape. I'm going to continue painting all the way across, lift out one or two more of these. Now our third way of making those lovely bokeh circles is to use a stencil, and this is probably the most common way of doing it. And people use many different tools for doing this. It's the one that you want to use if you want to lift out large areas of paint. So it's much more effective than something like masking fluid for lifting out those very big circles. It can have a really interesting layered effect. Let me show you how it works. So my background is dry at this point. I just want to show you how to soften the masking fluid. So once this is completely dry, and do make sure it's dry, including any paint that's settled on top of the masking fluid, you can rub it off like that. If it's a bit hard edged, then what you want to do is get your cotton bud like this, dip it in some clean water, and then you're going to squeeze it out. So you don't want it to be particularly wet. And then what you're going to do is just take some tiny circles around the edge from the inside. So you're doing tiny circles from the inside, and all you're going to do then is just soften those edges a little bit. So I'll be doing that to all of my masking fluid areas. You can see it's just pulling in a little bit of pigment as well, so it's not quite so hard edged. It depends how white and how hard edged you want it to be. I'm going for quite a subtle colour contrast here because this is a flower painting, but if you're doing something like Christmas lights or you know, something a bit more nighttime or a bit wintry, then you can go stronger with the color contrast and you'll get a stronger effect with the bokeh. So for the next technique, we're going to lift out, and as I said, this is bone dry now. Now there are 3 options for lifting out. We're going to be lifting out using a stencil. So I've got my stencil here, and we talked about alternatives earlier on. There's 3 things you can use. You can use a stiff brush like this, a damp acrylic brush. It's quite stiff and you can scrub your paper without ruining the brush. That's not my favourite. The other thing you can use is a sponge. Again, that's not my favourite. If you use a sponge or a brush like this, you want to make sure, or whatever you're using really, make sure that it's barely damp. It shouldn't be dripping wet. Don't apply a load of water because it'll seep under the stencil and you'll end up with some strange drying lines. I'm going to use this, which is my favourite, which is some cotton wool, this makeup sponge, but any kind of cotton wool or cotton wadding will do. And I'm going to dip this in clean water. Again, I'm going to wring it out so that it's barely wet. Now, if you have trouble with your hands, you've got arthritis, you have trouble squeezing like this, a good trick that you can do is you can just get some paper towel, put it on the floor, put whatever it is that you're trying to squeeze out inside that paper towel and just put the heel of your foot on it, and that'll squeeze it out nicely if you have trouble getting that real strong grip. So this is damp now. What I'm going to do now is just take my stencil and decide, you know, where I want to lift out some paint. How much paint lifts out depends on the pigments that you have used. I think we'll go here. Let's do this large one here. What I'm going to do now is just start taking small circles. You'll find out at this point what sort of quality your paper is. If almost immediately your paper surface starts to lift, it probably means you're on quite a cheap paper. It can still be done, just be a little bit careful. You may have to stop sooner than you would on a cotton rag paper, for example. You notice I've lifted pigment here. Now, at this stage, were I using a sponge or a brush, I would rinse and squeeze the excess water out of that sponge or brush to reapply it. For cotton wool, all I've got to do is find a clean area so that I'm not just lifting up pigment and then putting it back down again. And again, I'm just going to rub like this. And let's take that away. And there we are, that beautiful circle. I'm going to do a few of these in different sizes. Now our final bokeh technique is also done on dry paper, and this involves using white paint. You might think to yourself, well, I don't really want to use white paint with my watercolour, but it can be done in a way that's very subtle, and it has one main advantage. If there are any areas that are quite dark and you simply can't get them to lift out because perhaps you've used a staining colour, then white paint is the answer. So I'm going to go through the different types of white paint and the different ways that you can apply it. So I've lifted out my circles with my cotton wool, really pleased with the effects, and I've taken off all the masking fluid and softened those edges too. Now I'm going to look at using white paint. Now, what are the advantages to white paint? Well, there are actually several. I know people are very loath to use white paint in watercolour, but you can get quite a different look here, you can get a different effect. You'll notice that not all of the colour lifts out. You don't always get back to white. Look at the difference between this one and this one. It's all about the pigment you're lifting out. And again, on certain types of paper, if you're using a cheaper paper, you're going to find it hard to do this lifting out because your paper's going to start to lift. You won't have that problem with using white paint. Another thing is we can be a bit more specific with it, just like the masking fluid. So if you want to put some, next to the flower, we can do. And we can also adjust the transparency of the white by adding more or less water. And finally, we can add a little bit of colour to the white. For instance, if I've got some green here and I wanted a light pink circle, and we'll try this in a minute, then I'm going to be able to do that with more of an opaque medium. So there's lots of advantages to it. So I have got here some white paint. This is titanium white. Mine was labelled watercolour, but titanium white is more often labelled gouache. You also get Chinese white, which is sometimes called zinc white. They're the same thing. And those are more often labelled watercolour, but it's really up to the manufacturers. It doesn't really matter what sort of white you use. Be aware that titanium is more opaque than the zinc Chinese white is. So you'll get more of a transparent effect. If you've got a white in your watercolour set, it's more likely to be Chinese white. Personally, if I'm going to use a white, I like to use a solid white. I can always make it more transparent by adding water. What we're going to do this time is we're going to give ourselves a little bit of a guideline for painting. So again, using my stencil or anything you want to go around, and let's make a little circle here. You'll notice I took some of my circles off the edge of the paper. That's important. You don't want this to look too contrived. You just want it to look like it's just a background that's just sitting there. And then I'm going to get some water in this. And you can always experiment with any of these techniques. You can experiment on a scrap of paper. The more water you add in, the more transparent it will look. You can't really see. Often it will look quite opaque until it dries, and then, you know, hold your nerve, it'll become a little bit more transparent as it dries. If you wanted it to be more opaque, then you would, of course, add more pigment and less water. Let's have a go at the thing I was saying, whereby we can use a different colour. This is something you can't do any other way really, so the white is a big advantage here. So I'm going to take some white paint. I'm going to pop some across here because I want to use more of the white in the picture in a minute. And I'm just going to rinse my brush and grab a bit of my pink watercolour. So watercolour and gouache, completely, you know, you can mix them together. It's no problem at all. I think we'll go a little bit lighter than that. This is pink watercolour, but if you're using gouache paint, it can dry a little bit darker, so just watch out for that. So I'm going to add a bit more white in it here because ultimately I want this area to look lighter than the background. So let's find a part that there wouldn't be any pink in naturally. So what about up here? Again, let's make a circle, and I think I'll do a fairly small circle here. So let's draw this in, and you'll be able to rub this pencil out once your picture is dry. Don't try and get rid of the pencil before then. And again, I can just take this in here. If you find it doesn't show up much, you can add more white, or you can just allow it to dry and then put another layer in. But look how pretty that looks. And I think I'll do the same with some light blue. So I'm going to carry on now, put some white, some pink and some light blue in, and then I'll show you what it looks like in just a second. So I've got all my colours in now. I will be waiting until it's a bit drier before I erase the pencil marks. And of course I'll be careful not to touch any of this masking fluid that's still on the paper because that would lift that up. Now you can see what I've done in places. I've got some white, some light blue and some light pink. I've actually gone behind some of these other shapes, and that makes it also look much softer and much more realistic. You can use the white to cover up any mistakes you've made. I had a little bit of a drying line going through this one here. Look at that, I've just seen another one there. Let's paint that one in as well. I think we'll get a bit of the light blue for this one. So you can use this to highlight any areas where you want extra ones. Now when you're doing a very dark area like this, what you sometimes find is that the white paint starts to actually aggravate the paint underneath. In other words, it lifts it up and the area that you're painting becomes a bit mucky. If that happens, don't worry, simply let it dry, mix some clean white paint again and go on top. And I'm really happy with that result. So do let me know in the comments if you've had a go at the bokeh technique, if you're going to give it a go now. I hope this video has taught you something new. I always try to be very specific with techniques on this channel, so if you haven't subscribed so far, do remember to do that before leaving. It's absolutely free, and I have loads more watercolour painting and mixed media videos coming up for you this year. Don't forget to have a look in the video description as well. I have lots of free stuff there. You can find out about my courses, my Patreon subscription, and lots more as well, including my very lovely, very friendly Facebook group. If you are really interested in painting watercolour backgrounds, I've got another tutorial for you that you may enjoy. You can watch that one right now.